Sports have always been a huge part of my life. From being thrown into all the major American sports as a young child, to pursuing basketball throughout my teenage years, to watching 10 hours of football every Sunday. Sports are a source of entertainment that can rival any TV series, musician, or movie. There's this weird phenomenon with sports where it feels cinematic and fantasy-like even though it's very real. Where the storylines you follow feel like a TV show as you treat the players like characters, hurting when they hurt, celebrating when they celebrate, and having this image of them in your head as larger than life. Maybe this is due to athletes being a top 1% of superhumans on this planet, the way that it's sold to us for entertainment, or the spectacle of watching it live. Sports are a universal language that can bring people together. They can evoke some of the strongest emotions out of us, for better or for worse. They can even be a life-changing journey that follows us throughout decades of our lives. They are a part of the fabric of many people around the world. So it would only make sense that art, which reflects all parts of life and the human condition, would also reflect the magnitude, impact, and importance of sports. And this has brought us thousands of sports films that bridge the cinematic gap between the fantasy and reality of what it's like to play them, be around them, and live with them. And while researching this video, I didn't realize how many sports films I've watched in my life and just how many are out there. It's somewhat of a saturated genre, and because of that, it also doesn't get the attention and respect of other styles. But some of these movies, in my opinion, have some of the greatest storytelling, allegories, and emotional moments in film. So today I want to try and figure out why that is. I want to try and determine what makes them so compelling, and give this genre the respect it rarely gets. Now, I do understand for a non-sports fan this genre might not be of any interest, so what can a sports movie do to transcend all film audiences? Make sure to like and subscribe, and let's try to answer the question of what makes a good sports movie. And one more time, real quick, just look at this absolute beast right here. So, sports movies might be the easiest genre to define. Instead of something like a drama or a comedy where you have to meet certain requirements of storytelling and direction, all it really takes is sports being a part of the story. The sport is just the vehicle to tell the narrative and can work as background to what you're actually trying to say. And this can work in its favor a lot, which we will see in a second when it comes to the great ones, but this has also been a reason why the genre is so overlooked. The main culprit being sports comedies. Of course you have your Adam Sandler classics, your Will Ferrell classics, and a laundry list of sports comedies from the 80s to early 2000s. But these are just comedies. Very few, if any, really say anything about the sport itself. So it relies on whether or not you think it's actually funny, and since most of them aren't that funny, people just chalk these up to stupid guy humor. It's not really pulling from the sport to show the funny and relatable moments that happen and the relatable scenarios that many athletes go through. However, something like The Sandlot, Coach Carter, or Remember the Titans achieve this really well because they aren't full-on comedies, but they show these moments in a really earnest way. Sports is about camaraderie, friendship, going to battle with your fellow teammate, and in these journeys you will create these fun memories. You understand each other so well because of this, therefore you understand each other's humor, giving us something like the Ain't No Mountain High Enough scene in Remember the Titans. Or even on an individual level like Happy Gilmore, screaming at our golf ball to go in because we know it should have. We hit it perfectly. We know what these moments feel like because we, the sports audience, went through it ourselves. It's the universal language. Now, I think the best sports comedy is the original White Men Can't Jump because it follows this relatability to create its funny moments, but it stays the truest to the source material. Pickup basketball is the foundation of the sport. Not everyone plays at a competitive level, so they might not have the experience of playing on a team. But if you've played pickup basketball, you know everything there is to know about the community. This is where the love of the sport comes from, this is where you get the funniest moments, and this is where the most people can relate. Now, the second biggest culprit, but also one of the biggest allies to the sports genre, is sports fiction. So, sports movies mean a lot to athletes. They can be a motivating factor, they can be a part of this universal language, and they can provide some of the same lessons that playing the actual sport does. but they are the hardest to execute. Firstly, sports fiction works so well because it is playing on the cinematic feel of real life. Sports are romantic, they are dramatic, they can be tragic or triumphant. The underdog story is one of the most compelling ways to tell a story, and that term itself is synonymous with sports. To be overlooked, outmatched, to feel like someone or something is against you, is a feeling most of us experience. And to overcome that, or to work towards overcoming that, is one of the easiest ways to make the audience root for the character or group of characters. Then you have the comeback story, which is super similar, or even the fall off, David vs. Goliath. I mean, these are all very popular and common narratives, and the only time we see them in reality, on a grand scale, is with sports. So it's one of the easiest ways to relay that message for anyone to connect to in film, and I think this is because sports are so definitive. A comeback story about a person navigating through their life is up to interpretation. You know, there's so many ways characters can come to terms with their situation or feel at peace. It's all just about how we connect with their journey. We just want them to be quote-unquote happy, and that looks different for everyone and is shown in so many different ways. Whereas with sports, there's a definitive answer. You won, you lost, you scored, they scored, you start, you're done. And I believe the definitive outcomes of the story can elicit more emotion. There's nothing to be interpreted. The person you really wanted to win just lost, and you have to feel that hurt. The team no one thought could win finally did it. They accomplished the goal and they beat the character you hated. It is the ultimate level of satisfaction. So all sports fiction needs to do is make the characters compelling, easy to root for, or easy to hate, and the nature of sports takes care of the rest. Now, secondly, the reason these stories are so hard to execute is because it has to stay true to the source material. These stories are relatively pretty easy to create, which can in turn cause the filmmakers to be lazy or not try as hard. And this then shows itself with how accurate the gameplay is and how they talk about the sport. There is nothing worse when watching a sports movie when the actors clearly do not know how to play it or they don't understand the language. But that is a very hard thing to accomplish and a very easy thing to critique. You know, there's not that much crossover with acting and sports, so you really gotta take time to teach them how to play it. So with the nature of sports already being cinematic, you really just need good characters, a compelling narrative, and have them accurately play the sport. And more often than not, the abundance of sports movies never have all three. As much as I love Coach Carter, you know, one of my favorite sports movies ever, some of these plays are just absolutely ridiculous. But I think the best sports fiction film I've ever seen is He Got Game. But it does have the caveat that a very well accomplished actual NBA player, Ray Allen, is the star of the movie. But where the athlete turned actor lacks an on-camera talent, it is made up for by one of the greatest actors ever, Denzel Washington. And when it comes to the storytelling and character building, it's made by the great Spike Lee, so of course it's really good. And then the focus on the gameplay isn't as strong as some others, so there's less room for error. But when they are playing basketball, it does feel a lot more realistic. So maybe a good sports movie shouldn't have too much of the gameplay. Maybe it just needs to rely on what makes it so cinematic in the first place: the reality of sports. If sports are already so fairy tale-like in real life, why not just make movies about the most compelling true stories? Well, they do. Like, a lot. As I was creating my list of the greatest sports movies that I have ever seen, I soon realized that 7 out of my top 10 were based on true stories or just straight up biopics, and 4 out of my top 5 were as well. But this isn't really the case for any other genre of film. If you look at IMDb's highest rated movies, 2 out of the top 50 are based on true stories, and neither of them are biopics. 0 are in the top 100 highest grossing, and in Metacritic's top 100 rated movies, only 2 are fully based on true stories. One of them being Hoop Dreams, which is a basketball biopic. Is it biopics or biopics? It's gotta be biopics, right? And as you start to look through the highest rated sports films ever, it's just true stories everywhere. Coach Carter, Hurricane Season, Iron Claw, Hoop Dreams, 42, I, Tonya, Remember the Titans, Ali, Rush, King Richard, The Express, Chariots of Fire, Rudy, Hoosiers, Raging Bull, and Friday Night Lights. All of these are based on true stories or full-on biopics. Even Rocky is an amalgamation of real-life boxers Rocky Marciano and Chuck Wepner. So, does it need to be based in reality to be a good sports movie? Well, yes and no. Most of these true story movies are just a retelling of events, and because famous sports stories are already cinematic in nature, there's no creative liberties that need to be taken. They are true cases that are so groundbreaking and monumental that one could only say, this feels like a movie. So they made one. If anything, they act more as documentaries. Something like Remember the Titans, Friday Night Lights, or Coach Carter dramatize the events and give more insight to what these teams' journeys were like. We just see the end result. We don't see what it took to get there, and these can be very inspiring stories that are easy to root for, so it's turned into a narrative. But with these films and the non-fiction ones that follow the same formula, most of the themes are the same and, no hate, kind of simple. Of course, it's good to be reminded about the importance of hard work, dedication, teamwork, purpose, what it takes to win or lose, and how it feels. But when I said sports fiction is also a main culprit to the genre being overlooked, it's because the themes are relatively basic and not that thought-provoking. It doesn't make them any less important, but there's a large amount of people who want more out of film, making a lot of sports movies seem too straightforward. But the psychology of sports goes so much deeper. It mirrors many aspects of life and is so important to the fabric of so many people, like I had said before. A good sports movie has something to say about the sport and makes you care. But a great one has something to say about life and the psychology of an athlete. When I took away my personal bias of basketball being my favorite sport and those movies being my favorites, and tried to objectively look at what are the greatest sports movies, I found two common threads between all of them. Let's see if you can see them too. Raging Bull, The Iron Claw, I, Tonya, He Got Game, Rocky, Hoop Dreams, The Wrestler, Foxcatcher, and I'm hesitant to do this with it being so fresh, but I'm going to throw challengers in there because it really helps the point I'm about to make. But what do you see? First, there's definitely an emphasis on fighting, with 5 of the movies being about boxing or wrestling. All of these movies definitely transcend the title of sports film, acting as great movies beyond being a sports film, which is very important. And 7 out of 9 of them are based on true stories. But the two most important qualities of these films is they focus on the individual, 7 of them being about individual sports, and 2, they use sports as a metaphor. When you dive into the psychology of an athlete, you have to look at why they got into this field, what motivates them, and what they are working towards. To become a professional athlete is borderline psychotic. I mean, the dream itself is delusional because of how rare it is, and the work and lifestyle requirements it takes are torturous, consuming, and almost like an addiction. We love to say Mamba mentality and idolize being like Jordan, Tyson, or Serena Williams, but after the Last Dance Jordan documentary came out, or King Richard about the Williams sisters' father, a lot of people took a step back and realized how insane these people's lives are. The way Jordan viewed the game was psychotic. I mean, he was psychotic, but that's what made him so great. The countless hours the Williams sisters spent practicing under the iron fist that was their father can be looked at in so many different ways. But he molded them into the greatest tennis family in history. Did he just view them as projects? Or did he lift them up out of love and his belief in them? And I think the fact that most of the examples I'm using for this section are based on real stories is because these real-life aspects of sports are so much more complex than people realize. So by them using sports as a metaphor or allegory, it is as compelling as a movie that comments on any other societal topic. Some great examples of this are Challengers and The Iron Claw. Challengers uses sports as a metaphor for the power dynamic in these relationships and the sexual tension between these characters. There's a dominance factor at play, especially with the 2 male leads, and there's this constant theme of them getting their spark back, which is very much tied to the romantic aspect of the relationship and the fragile nature of masculinity. Tennis is a great sport to use for this because it's an individual sport, where you need to outlast your opponent, use brute force, and you have to be completely mentally locked in, not faltering for even a second, or you will slip up and lose. Tennis is probably the only sport you could use as a sexual metaphor, and it's a perfect one to use. I mean, every time a player hits a ball, they moan. And the movie takes it even deeper with the male relationship and how it's defined and ruined due to fragile masculinity. There's constant competition, and once anything sexual is involved with another person or even between themselves, that male mindset gets in the way and can cause lifelong damage to that relationship. Mentally, they are going one-on-one back and forth, trying to dominate the other person, which is just like the sport of tennis. Then you have The Iron Claw, which is for one just a perfect movie, but it touches more on subjects like generational trauma and the fragile, a lot of the times toxic masculinity, which goes on between sons and their father and then brotherhood. This curse that Kevin keeps referring to is the trauma, and them getting into wrestling is them inheriting that curse. The father has practically forced them all into this profession, and it's used as a metric for how much he loves and respects them. Without spoiling too much if you haven't seen it, the second they start wrestling or advance further into their wrestling career, that's when the quote-unquote Von Erich curse starts to take over their lives. Wrestling is just a metaphor for the battle within the family dynamic, the chase for their father's approval, and the internal conflict with their ego, purpose, and desire to be loved. Now, as much as I love The Iron Claw, there is one movie that I've seen tackle the same topics, but better and with more depth. And that is, in my opinion, the greatest sports film of all time. Martin Scorsese's 1980 boxing biopic, Raging Bull. A quick shameless plug, but I have already talked about this movie in depth and at length in its own video, link in description of course. So if you want the full scope of how this film used his fighting career as a metaphor for much larger subjects, I highly encourage you go check that one out. Obviously I'm biased, but I do think it's a really good video. But what I will say now is that this film takes it one step further. So thematically, of course it's using sports as a metaphor, but it also uses the cinematography of the boxing matches in a way that I've never seen. His fights mirror his mental state at the time, whether it's during a rematch of his arch nemesis Sugar Ray, if it's a fight happening directly after a major life event, or at a certain point in his relationships with other people. But to fully capture these themes, Scorsese altered the boxing ring, used different camera tricks, and mirrored the shots to Jake's mental state. Sugar Ray is depicted as a reflection of his own ego, the real person he is fighting being himself, his inner demons. And we see this with the shots of him coming out of the darkness surrounded by smoke, almost like he is seeing him as this monster. Then the actual boxing rings were made bigger or smaller to signify how Jake feels in this situation. When he's confronted with himself, it looks like there's no one else in the crowd, and they made the ring smaller to make it feel like he's trapped, forcing to face his reality. So the career Jake LaMotta had, the fights, the preparation, the wins, the losses, they are all just a vehicle to tell the narrative of a fragile man with a ginormous ego and how this affects the people around him along with himself. The fights are literally a direct one-to-one recreation of the verbal fights he has with his wife and his brother. And again, I go over this way more in depth in that other video, link in description. But what makes this the greatest sports movie ever, besides its spectacular cinematography, its Oscar-worthy acting, the careful and precise depictions of the sport itself, is that it doesn't need to be a sports movie. It is a very real-life human story that depicts an issue that's been around since the dawn of man, and has become even more prevalent in today's society. But this also shows a big problem with the genre as a whole, with representation. I mean, how many times did I use the word masculinity in this last section? How many of these movies are from the perspective of a man in the first place? It's pretty hard to have a genre reach all audiences when a lot of the time it can alienate half of it. I know I'm not the one to talk about this, but I have to point out that there aren't enough movies that handle the same themes, but from a woman's perspective in women's sports. And then if the movie doesn't even tackle bigger themes in general, it just turns into a superhero movie. Good guy hero finally beats the bad guy villain. We need more sports films to do more than be stupid guy humor, superhero-esque narratives, and another take on toxic masculinity. There is so much to be said with sports, yet it seems like they are all saying the same things, or not saying anything at all. In the last couple years, something like Challengers and the Iron Claw have been a breath of fresh air, and something like Raging Bull from 1980 is now more prevalent than ever. The highs of this genre are really high, but a lot of people only know about the lows. So let's get back to my original question. What makes a good sports movie? So after looking at all the kinds of sports movies and what made them good and what made them bad, I think I've narrowed down 4 elements that are necessary for the genre. Number 1, and probably the most important, you've gotta have well-written characters. Whether that be the most hateable villain imaginable, i.e. an Ivan Drago, the most easy to root for hero like Rudy, or a complex leader like Coach Carter, I have to care about these people and believe in their purpose. Number 2, you have to stay true to the sport. Recreating the visuals and language of the sport being represented needs to be at the top of the list of importance, or it will look absolutely ridiculous. Number 3, a compelling journey / strong narrative. That just goes with any movie in general, but some of these sports movies still somehow manage to miss that aspect. Whether it's a real life story or not, it's gotta be more than Team A beats Team B. And number 4, it has to say something interesting about the sport, and maybe even something about life. A lot of sports movies only have 2 to 3 of these elements, and while they still make for an entertaining watch, they don't transcend the genre. And no, not every movie has to be groundbreaking, but the more we get of these cookie-cutter sports stories, the more saturated the genre becomes. And the films that have all 4 are the great ones I discussed, and they help bridge the gap of these films reaching all audiences. To be a great sports movie, it has to be more than just a sports movie, because in life, sports are more than just sports.